Okay, so the central question of my contribution is really more precisely what is post-Kantian idealistic philosophy of nature? And an answer to this question is giving somehow informally using the example of Schelling's philosophy of the years 1798 and 1799. And my contribution is somehow related to a more general theme, and this theme is the self-understanding of philosophy and its relation to the sciences. Uh, Now, the self-understanding of philosophy I want to begin with is the self-understanding of Kant and his critical philosophy, because we are more familiar with that. And certainly Schelling tries to distinguish himself from a Kantian standpoint. So Kant, as is well known, aims to identify necessary theses in our understanding of nature, insofar as we refer to it, and to secure somehow the validity of its claims through the so-called transcendental idealism. Uh, Now, I would like to show that the philosophy of nature, as discussed in this paper, is incompatible with the Kantian project, and it cannot be developed from an immanent critique of it. What is required is an entire change in philosophical motivation. One could say that something like a metaphysical interest guides the philosophical theorizing on nature, namely taking account of and recognizing the self-sufficiency of nature, both theoretical and in our attitudes towards it. The same applies to the relative independence of that which corresponds most explicitly to the principle of nature, namely the living being. Schelling even speaks of the autonomy of nature. And this does not only mean that the laws and the active and moving principles are to be understood as immanent of nature. Our approach to nature as such is also incorrect if we regard its sphere as something like posited by our subjectivity. Uh, in relation to the living being, recognizing its relative independence means something, not just considering it something where causal chains which start from outside go through it. So that's somehow the idea. And giving up a Kantian approach to nature has now direct consequences for the relationship between nature and the sciences. For it follows that it's no longer possible to draw a clear dividing line between philosophy of nature on the one hand and scientific research on the other hand. Moreover, philosophy of nature is not neutral with regard to theses of the sciences, as it was the case, for example, before Kant in Leibniz. Rather, the modified idea of philosophy of nature actively intervenes in the formation of claims in the natural sciences. And today we're kind of inclined to say, well, that's not a bad thing. Because if it would be such that, as Maimon said it with reference to Kant, we just stand, so to speak, within transcendental philosophy and operate only in defense. So if that was the claim, it would be unclear what philosophy of nature could contribute to issues such as the ecological crisis or so. But where exactly is the dividing line or the division of labor between natural philosophy and natural sciences? So where is it to be drawn, or how does a division of labor work? So that's part of the second part of my article. And in the concluding third part, I try to point out that the same concept of nature that leans into the discussion of scientific problems can also be the foundation of an ethical attitude towards nature. Uh, it is grounded on something like a trace of the unconditioned, which is present in the living being. And it's thereby an ethical relationship which does not primarily based in our relation to ourselves, such as it is the case, for example, in Kant's animal ethics. And finally, I would like to say that the same holds that the same concept of nature Schelling tries to explore also is a basic for something like an artistic engagement in arts with nature. And once again, an engagement which is not just the projection of a lyrical self, but a recognition of what nature already is. So that's all part of the third part of my paper. Good. So part number one, strategy, starting point, and method of of philosophy of nature. So for Schelling, philosophy of nature makes assertions of necessity about its subject area. there are certain facts I cannot fail to presuppose when I reflect on nature. And thereby, he does not mean claims where the opposite contains a contradiction. It's rather we are dealing with necessities in a more substantial sense. Now, that's a strong thesis to begin with, but it's not unfamiliar to us because it's the same claim we also find in Kant's transcendental philosophy. Now, let's start with Kant and then have a look on how Schelling tries to develop his project in contrast to that. So, as is well known, Kant specifies certain conditions, those of sensibility and of understanding, without which an object of contemplation could not be given or could not be thought at all. He then concludes that all objects that can come as subject for us must necessarily correspond to these conditions. Quote, with this formal condition of sensibility, therefore, all phenomena necessarily agree, because they can only appear through it, that is, be empirically observed and given. And likewise, quote, accordingly, concepts of objects in general as conditions a priori underlie all empirical knowledge, for then they necessarily and a priori refer to object of experience, because only by means of them can any object of experience be thought at all. Now, according to this strategy, somehow, Kant says we prescribe laws a priori to nature, or as the sum total of all phenomena. So that has been often been discussed. It's under the heading of impositionalism. So there's a kind of a subject which kind of imposes its standards to the object. And in contrast to that, Schelling surprisingly assures us that, quote, in this science, that is philosophy of nature, no idealistic modes of explanation take place, such as transcendental philosophy can well give, end of quote. And in his kind of useful boldness, he adds, for every idealistic mode of explanation dragged over from its proper domain into that of the explanation of nature degenerates into the most monstrous nonsense, of which the examples are all well known. So that would be, that's his attitude towards it. And now, natural philosophy starts somehow from nature in its independence. Starting from there, it even kind of pursues the opposite direction. So you start from nature in its independence, and thereby you, so to speak, step by step, go more to the subjective level. And this procedure is supposed to be the complement to a transcendental philosophy that pursues the opposite direction. In the end, one may then suspect that the claims to validity or the objectivity claims we make from the human standpoint may depend on the fact that nature by itself, so to speak, from itself comes and carries and supports these presuppositions. So if that would be the case, one would argue, well, without philosophy of nature, the overall system would not be possible. So there's some kind of connection from the two. So you approach things from two different sides. From nature, you go step by step and move forwards to the self. From the self, you go step by step forward to nature as a subject. However, if this is the case, one has not extended or modified the Kantian approach to necessity, but one has completely ruined it. For would not the same reservation apply that Kant raised at the end of the B deduction against the so-called preformation system of pure reason? One could still say that we kind of inevitably have to make certain connections in our thinking. However, this would initially only be an insight about ourselves as thinkers and the way in which we are organized, the condition under which we stand in our thinking. It would then have to be added as an additional fact that the sphere of objects, nature as a whole, is constituted in such a way that it actually corresponds to our organization in thinking. We can no longer derive from the way in which we think about the condition of access to natural objects, insofar as we grasp them, to the fact that they themselves have necessarily been constituted in a certain way. To put it bluntly, Kant's objection to the preformation system is that it's ultimately only good luck that the determinations like the categories and nature correspond to each other. Now the question is, can this debate really be used to characterize Schelling's position? Uh, First of all, it seems clear that Schelling's insistence on recognizing the independence of nature and the immanence of its mode of explanation is just based on a different theoretical motivation than Kant. And accordingly, Schelling's divergent approach cannot be explained in such a way that there's Kant, there's certain problems, and then we see how Schelling responds to it. But of course, Schelling does not want simply to add something like a metaphysical realism as a further component to transcendental philosophy, because if he would do that, any claim to necessity in relation of nature would simply have been abandoned. And of course, we wouldn't want to say either that the transcendental part can still do the whole job in generating objectivity, because if that were the case, so to speak, we wouldn't need philosophy of nature in the first place. So you see, there's a trouble. If you want to get from Kant to Schelling, there's a problem. And so what we have to do is we have to change the entire picture. In the language of necessary conditions. Unlike the Kantian forms of intuition and the apparatus of the categories, however, this sphere is not originally assigned to the subject only. You know there are two different claims, like you make transcendental claims and you say that these claims have a subjective origin, and you have to give up the second claim. The sphere is rather the place where subjects and nature as objects can diverge and be related to each other. It encompasses both subjects and nature. Therefore, it encompasses everything which can be meaningful object and subject in the first place. And now the necessary condition associated with that sphere, they go into nature and philosophy of nature as a part of it. So as an analogy, think here, for example, for some of you who do a bit of history of philosophy, think, for example, of some form of transcendental phenomenology. There you have kind of conditions that constitute what it means to be an object. But these conditions are not kind of anchored or derived from the subject in any way. Still they have a constitutive status. So that's something somehow similar to what Schelling has in mind. And since necessary conditions of the entire sphere go into the realm of nature, so this realm corresponds somehow to the transcendental sphere itself. Thus, nature appears to be comprehensive. We cannot grasp anything completely external to it. And therefore, nature itself appears to be independent. And for this reason, Schelling can argue that even though nature seems to be only part of a relationship which is on the one side subject, on the other side the object and nature, he can still say that this is a form of Spinozism of nature, as he says, because, so to speak, in this self-relation, where the part corresponds to the whole, the part seems to be as independent as the whole is a part of. And that's important for the overall construction. That's the first step. Second step, now what's the starting point of philosophy of nature given this starting point? So because of the independence of nature in its comprehensive character, we will have to first to refer something that's immanent to the observation of nature as a whole, something without which nature cannot be understood. And Schelling has already the natural sciences in mind and the key position that action and forces play in the sciences. So therefore he claims that a dynamic activity in original processuality must play the most fundamental role. Without it, natural phenomena would not occur at all. And on the other hand, in nature, we're always dealing with concrete figurations, spatiotemporal structure. And that can only be explained on the basis of a presupposed dynamic activity if one assumes that different activities strive against each other. However, this assumed duality or plurality of different modes and directions of activity that cannot be derived from one, so to speak. You start with the entire set, and it's justified on the basis that it works, given that you have to explain the phenomena. And for if one were just to emphasize a productive mode of activity or the productive mode of activity in isolation as a basis, and activity would result which flowers into something like a boundless thing. So it never gets to any structure. So we need the plurality of forces where one goes ahead and the other blocks it, such that we can explain how structure is possible in the first place. And as is well known, Schelling calls this activity the inhibition, and inhibition is a crystallization point for creation. And finally, despite its limited nature, the form also expresses the encompassing mode of the activity, and this is only possible if the formed entity also points beyond itself. So we have here the all-encompassing activity. There are different activities with blocks. They play a role that there is something like shape and figuration. And the shape of figuration can only express the all-encompassing activity if it's not just there and ends where it is, but it's related to its own borders and goes beyond them at the same time. Otherwise, it couldn't represent what it's representing in the first place. So that's the image that Schelling is trying to provide as a starting point. And so we have talking about a meta-philosophical location, and we're talking about a starting point. And the third thing we're talking about is what methodology has philosophy of nature, or what methodology uses philosophy of nature. The point of reference is again a Kantian concept of method. And philosophy of nature in the Schelling way has to pick up the kind of Kantian idea and take a distance to it at the same time. And the fundamental idea he's referring to is construction. So what's the mode of, how does philosophy of nature proceed? It proceeds in the mode of construction. And in Kantian terms, to construct a concept means, first of all, to represent a priori the intuition that corresponds to it. So on the one hand, this means that something general and intelligible, a concept or a theorem, is exemplified in the corresponding intuitive sphere. And what we grasp in this exemplification is something like a spatio-temporal structure of being, things being outside and next to another or after another. And this exemplification is characterized as being a priori. So what we're really talking about are matter of quantitative determinations that underlie mathematical concepts. So that's approach to construction we find in Kant. And secondly, the activity, our doing, is at the center. It's constitutive for the object of knowledge. So, for example, constructing a concept of the circle means being in a position to draw the circle, and the concept is nothing other than the rules which tell us how to do so. The same holds for geometrical theorems and not just for concepts. So take the parallel axiom. So that says something, if two straight lines form an inner angle with a third one such that they are smaller than two right angles, then they intersect if they are sufficiently extended. So we have here a line, you have two different lines like that, they have a smaller angle, and you can construct that. So if you move one thing to the other such that they actually intersect, and then you have a principle of extension we find in Kant, which applies that you can see that that must hold for all possible things. That would be something where you construct something, and it matters that we are the very ones who are doing it. So it's not the result on the blackboard. It doesn't tell you anything. What you need is you need to see how that has been done. And that's the two core elements. And for Kant, that relates on the one hand to mathematics. It also relates to natural sciences. The first uncontroversial examples, for example, the eclipse of the sun based on how the planets and the Earth and the sun are kind of rotating. That's merely a geometrical issue. However, it also matters when he talks in the metaphysical foundation of natural sciences, where he talks about construction, and there he presupposes matter and talks about the constraints under which he can work with these presuppositions. And again, he uses the term of construction, and again, it's on mathematics. And now for Schelling, story must go different. So he's not in a position to start, so to speak, with our activity and then claim that our activity is kind of constitutive for the object, because that would kind of contradict the entire project of philosophy of nature, which is about the independence of nature. So there's no projecting from what we do onto nature here, what is going on. Accordingly, so Schelling always talks about activity and activity, but really he dims down the role of activity. If you think what construction means for him, it's rather, if we look at the phenomenon and we have this idea of the diverse forces, and we're in a position to see the forces through the phenomenon, so to speak. That's the idea he has in mind. And in particular, he's dimming down the role of our activity. He focuses on expression, representation, exemplification, really, in what's going on. And he does not want to limit it only to mathematical physics, but he wants to include the organic as well in the idea of construction. And that means that he has to rely somehow on qualitative properties as well. And so only in that case, the object is really nature. So it's not such, in Kant, you know, you can have the mode of construction, but you can remove it, keep it, so to speak, as a mathematical apparatus and remove it from nature. It's still the same. And that means that through the apparatus, you don't really understand what nature is. And therefore, Schelling has to change the overall setup of the story here. And because the object is nature, it makes particular sense to emphasize, as Schelling does, that all the propositions under considerations are first and foremost also propositions of experience. So that's important. All propositions, philosophy of nature, are also propositions of experience. But that does not mean that he wants to give completely up the idea of the a priori. It's more the idea that the same propositions can be both a priori and empirical. That's an unusual claim for a Kantian, but that's what Schelling tries to tell us. And his idea is somehow that we look at them from an a priori angle. If we try to understand the phenomenon from the perspective of the underlying principles of nature, which are the different forces I have been talking about. And of course, they're also related to each other, and they're related to a couple of intermediate propositions before they try directly to the first principles. But then you would say something, well, look, obviously he's starting from empirical propositions and do some kind of job of systematization, but that's exactly the same what the science do as well. So therefore, so to speak, there's no direct clear border between what the sciences do and what the philosophy of nature does. There's more something like an overlap between the different domains. I mean, that's a crucial part for what philosophy of nature does. So in Kant, it's clear that's what the philosopher does, and that's what the empirical scientist does. And Schelling kind of undermines the basis for this distinction. Now, this leads us to part number 2 of my paper, and the part number 2 is about the division of labor between philosophy of nature on the one hand and the sciences on the other hand. And so the idea I try to explore here is that philosophy of nature offers something like an orientation. And an orientation can mean different things. On the one hand, it offers an orientation, so in respect of the direction of explanation. So where does the explanation start from? Which is explanatory more basic, and which is explanatory derivative? So that's kind of Schelling's idea. So the philosophy of nature helps us to get an orientation about these matters. And we have already seen that's a very elementary case. For Schelling, so to speak, it's not primarily presence of movement of change, but rather the absence of that, but needs to be explained. So his famous example are kind of the whirlpool in the river. So that looks like a stable form, but it's really only a continuous interlocking of various forces. And how is it possible that it looks stable? That's to be explained. And organisms are in the same sense kind of stable forms. So how, given that really the universe is built on forces, how is it possible that there is a relative stability? Now, that's something which is kind of intuitively plausible, but Schelling also holds stronger claims. One claim in particular that he thinks that the organism and the theory of the organism is explanatorily more fundamental than the mechanical sciences. That's now a rather unusual claim. And once again, it's philosophy who tells us what the orientation or what the direction in the explanation actually is. It leads from the organic to the inorganic. Now, compared to the previous assumptions, we are now dealing with a quite strong claim. And this claim consists of two parts. The basis is that an organism in its structure should be anchored in nature itself and in its principle. In the organism, the principle finds its expression most appropriately and most directly, and it does do so in a kind of a reflected form. Schelling also expresses that in a kind of meta-philosophical turn. It says, the organic production of the product is at least a symbol of the original construction of all products. So we see in the organic something like it's a model of what happens in the construction of all the other products. And now this leads obviously directly to the question of how the connection between nature and the organic is to be understood. So we started from a dynamic activity that is simultaneously slowed down by counteracting forces so that formation becomes possible. At the same time, this counter-striving prevents the original activity from being completely absorbed in its effect, in its product. Like lava, which solidifies when it emerges from the Earth's interior, the moment of rigidity, immobility, and lifelessness also emerges as an aspect of the constitution of what is created. Under these conditions, the product can only continue to be an expression of the original if it does not fall prey to the danger of being kind of petrified altogether. It must be in a position to reproduce itself anew against the limiting factors. It must do this if it strives to be the most appropriate expression possible. However, it can also do this because there's always a surplus of activity and mobility. For if, assuming the impossible, the original activity were completely absorbed in its result, this way of reproducing itself would be ruled out because then the activity would have exhausted itself completely in the product. Could imagine that, no? It has exhausted in the product, no energy left in the world. So that's not a possibility. And so the product can represent the original activity only insofar that it is itself active, and it must be active in response to an input which comes from outside. So it's active in the overcoming of the limitations which are continuously acting against it. So that's the idea. And here there's a kind of double relation of self-sustaining activity and receptivity at the same time. So being active and counter-striving, and all that is incorporated in what this very being is. And that's why Schelling says it constitutes itself only in the pushing against an external world. So that's how it is structured. And we have seen above that the original dynamic activity can only be present in the transition into the project, not before and not completely in the product. And so it's precisely in the moment of overcoming the external limitation, and that goes hand in hand with the assimilation of what comes from outside, that the organism can actually grasp itself. So Schelling says, quote, only at the point into which the external resistance falls can that activity be perceived as an activity that is both immanent and directed outside. And conversely, only at the point from which that external activity is reflected in itself does the resistance fall. What does not fall in this point is not there at all for the organic, end of quote. That's something which kind of defines the external boundary of the being from within. And what's out there is obviously a plurality of different things. So it's a being which has a world around it. And thereby we come to understand why Schelling thinks that that could be paradigmatically an organism. So we see that there's a general idea of what nature is, and you can derive directly what the notion of an organism is. And from the notion of an organism, he can go on and exemplify it in the empirical theory, talking, for example, about Brown's theory of excitability, which is the direct empirical counterpart of this starting point. And good, so that's one claim. Why is the organism so fundamental? It's fundamental because it expresses nature more directly than anything else. Next question is, how do we get from there to an explanation of something like the physical world? And there are different tentative efforts Schelling makes. On the one hand, he's very influenced by Jacobi, and Jacobi thinks that the difference between coincidences and causal relations is only present if we ourselves are agents. And being agent means to be an embodied creature which is in a position to start a movement. And so in that sense, the organic being and the idea of an organic being precedes the possibility of the sciences. Second, Schelling believes that the structure of the organic being is somehow corresponding to what happens in magnetism, chemistry or so, but they are kind of more dimmed down. And finally, of course, if you start from a mechanism, the organism is always something unusual. If you start from the organism, so to speak, the mechanical world always has to be presupposed. And that's a kind of standpoint. And given this standpoint, so to speak, the perspective Schelling has is somehow the paradigm of a scientist is, for example, the ecologist. So an ecologist who looks at the ecosystem, he starts with some kind of plans and tries to determine the other things, for example, how much what the quality of the water is, and so what is the air composed of, so starting from the organism. Another example would be something like a physician, so a medical doctor, which analyzes, so to speak, the environmental influences. All these are, so to speak, paradigm cases of natural sciences, scientists in the Schellingian perspective. I should mention maybe more briefly that that's not the only way in which philosophy of nature offers some kind of orientation. According to Schelling, there's some other way of offering orientation. Namely, he's interested in showing how philosophy of nature helps to dissolve, so to speak, tensions in some kind of dialectical reasonings. Orientation and dissolve dialectical reasoning problems. These are kind of Kantian approaches, but he kind of turns Kant upside down. So for Kant, if we move too far away from the empirical sphere, we ask for the unconditioned and so on, we come into the area of metaphysics, we are kind of entangled in dialectical reasoning. And for Schelling, it's just he turns it upside down. It's just the contrary. We are involved in dialectical reasoning once we're in the empirical sphere. And we're involved in dialectical reasoning in the empirical sphere if we fail to relate the empirical phenomena to the unconditioned. So that's his suggestion. And I have two examples where he tries to do that. Now they come from the very, 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 very early levels of biology. So please have a mercy if they're not very elaborate. So he has two different, he discusses two different options. One is the debate of the ground of life. So on the one hand, he argues, there are positions who think that the ground of life is somehow a property of matters of chemistry, and so there's the interaction of chemical substances, and they kind of offer something like a pre-form of life. And the other opportunity is something where the ground of life comes entirely outside of the animal matter. And surprisingly, he refers here to a question of how the nerve system kind of starts. And he argues that the ground of life must be somehow outside of the living product. And so there must be something outside to get the nerve system started in the first place. And Schelling says that both positions are kind of misleading. For on the one side, so he argues, as Jacobi did before, life cannot be a property of matter because the living being itself is nothing than an instantiation of life. So it's the other way around. Life is more fundamental, and beings instantiate life, and life is not a property of the matter of beings. On the other side, the ground cannot be outside because either the organism would be completely passive or it's already some kind of a passivity which is open to take something up, but then it's circular because you already presuppose that's an organism. And he argues in the same way about another issue in the early philosophy of biology. So on the one hand, so to speak, life is virtually identified with chemical processes, for example, metabolic processes. And on the other hand, there's something like vitalism. So there's something like the Blumenbach's Bildungstrieb, which is going there, which is going on. And Schelling argues that postulating a Bildungstrieb doesn't explain anything. On the other hand, he is skeptical about the idea that chemical processes by itself are sufficient to account for life. And the problem is not so much that here are chemical processes and there's something inner, like a proto-problem of mind and body. That's not the problem. There's an inner behind all different forms of nature, but they're categorically different structures. For Schelling, same for Hegel, chemical process lead towards imbalance. So they lead towards a state of stability. But the organism is kind of in a position to reproduce itself. So it can't be something that is structured on that grounds either. So here you see, the underlying idea is somehow that there is a dialectic, there are two different positions. Both positions are insatisfying, but these are really empirical claims. And what's wrong with them? That they fail to relate that to the underlying unconditioned. Then they have a different idea of what nature is and what life is, and the dialectic can be dissolved. And in that respect, philosophy can provide help to biology, however, as I said, just to the most early versions of it. Good. So that was part number one. So what's the basic setup? Meta-philosophical claims about the sphere, transcendental sphere, issues about the starting point, issues about methodology. Conclusion of that, there's no clear boundary between philosophy and natural science. Part two, so what are these two doing? And the idea is philosophy of nature offers some kind of orientation. It tells you where to start your explanation, what has to be reached in the explanation, and it helps to dissolve immanent problems in the philosophy of nature. Good. Now I'm nearly done. I just have a brief outlook I want to characterize. So one of the opportunities offered by this type of philosophy of nature is the following. The same concept of nature, which leads to the natural sciences, can also serve as a basis for something like an ethical attitude or a pro-ethical attitude towards nature and the natural. And the key point is the independence of nature itself and the independence of that which corresponds independence of nature. It's about the self-sufficiency and autonomy of nature. And since the living being corresponds mostly in the system towards it, it's also a claim about its relative, so to speak, self-sufficiency. And according to Schelling, so to speak, nature's independence, because we ourselves are independent, nature runs toward us and at the same time leaves a blank spot for our irreducible self-understanding. To the extent that nature and the living being are independent, there is something like a trace of being unconditioned in them. This in turn is a basis for us as independent beings to enter in something like a relationship of recognition with it. And in doing so, this does not happen on the basis of something like a projective re-enchantment of nature, but on the idea of what the constitution of nature is itself. And that is somehow a different approach. So that's an approach where you have an idea that there's an ethical attitude with nature, which is kind of based in something like a metaphysical stance. So it's not a kind of non-metaphysical ethics, and it's not a type of ethics, as I said at the beginning, as, for example, in Kant. So in Kant also, we have to respect, for example, animals and living beings. But the reason why we have to respect is that we get brutal ourselves, so to speak. We harm ourselves in the relation to that. And that seems to be kind of an indirect explanation, which may not be the best we are looking for. The same holds for issues which have now been much discussed, that, for example, an aesthetic theory of nature is a basis for an ethics of nature. Well, I'm not sure about that. So there are many kind of wetlands which are not aesthetically pleasing or anything. Still, they're rich and we should recognize them, and that has to do with other reasons. So in that sense, there may be interest in something like a more metaphysical attitude in ethics toward nature. Now, Schelling's approach to nature, however, is also open to kind of an artistic treatment or a treatment in literature of it. And once again, we thereby address nature in a way where it's not, so to speak, this subject which its inner machinations, which has some kind of feeling and then projects it only onto nature, but it's again kind of taking into account what nature actually is. So he says, for example, in the beginning of the world soul, that there's something like an analogical insight into the common principle of nature which runs through the organic and the inorganic. And it is, he says, handed down to us only in poetic conceptions by the oldest philosophers to which we have to return. And so the artistic sphere is here as a medium for representing things in analogy, things in comparison, things in variation. And Schelling certainly deepens the reference to poetry in his discussion with Goethe, who in turn, for example, presents the metamorphosis of plants in a poem. So he has a theory about the plants, and then he moves that into the poetic speech, and in the poem compares that to marriage and so on and so on. And no one may wonder, as a final question, whether a structural theory of the living, even if it refers to the whole of nature, should not better be established within, so to speak, an empirical theory alone. And for Schelling, the answer would be no, because if that were true, it couldn't be at the same time a practical metaphysics of nature, and that's what he intended to do. Thank you.